We are back, and we have with us today Hans Dietrich, and he is joining us for a very special show. And we are going to be talking all about corporate symbolism. Are there secrets embedded in these logos that we find all around us? Every day, we often see the goddess on the side of our coffee cups. And this, of course, is Melusine, who is the serpentine mother of the European royal families. And there's so much of this type of symbolism that we're inundated with. But before we go further down that rabbit hole, we talked to Hans. I want to make a few announcements to you all. We are definitely looking at growing our channel here, and I need all of you to be a part of that. So that includes liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing these videos with your friends. Let's get them out there. And the reason that I wanted to do these shows, these Johnny Enoch Presents shows, is that I'm out there with Gaia, I'm out there with Travel Channel, we're working with Discovery Channel, all sorts of things. But oftentimes we're limited on what type of guests that we can talk to, what kind of topics we can get into. And don't get me wrong, these shows are fantastic. And I'll have links below where you can find these shows or you can become a subscriber. But what we want to do here is just really rapid fire, intelligent discourse and continue bringing on awesome guests, great conversations and great topics. That includes a conversation with all of you. Even if you agree or disagree, we want you involved in the conversation. So if you get a chance, you can also contribute, where there's a button for that. Or if you get a membership on our channel, we're going to have longer format interviews, and we're going to keep growing this, and it's going to get very exciting. Of course, also, I want to tell you all about these amazing functional mushrooms I've been taking, and you hear me talk about it a lot, but I can't talk about them enough. They're just fantastic. Lion's mane, which I know Hans takes also, it is amazing. It helps boost your memory, your focus, your concentration. It's great for the immune system. Cordyceps, you get these. They're great for energy, libido, stamina, the adrenals, everything. And there's so many other great ones. If you go to neurobuddha.com, head to that website, smash in the code Enoch20 on checkout in the coupon section, you'll get 20% off. And we definitely want to give a shout out to Michelle Hood's Light the Light Pyramids. These are incredible. She's got so many amazing Oregon products on her website. Go there, support her. She's amazing. And if you have some great products that are helping change the world, tell us about them. We want to know all about it and what you're doing to make this reality a better place. So before I get into the interview with Hans, I want to open this up today with a quote. And this quote is from one of my heroes, who of course is Manly Palmer Hall, who is probably the greatest philosopher and master of our times. He had written over 150 books. He did over 8,000 extemporaneous lectures at the top of his head that are just truly amazing. You can look them up online. And of course, he had written countless articles. He wrote The Secret Teachings of All Ages. So much incredible work, a true esoteric master. This is what he said. He said, "When the human race learns to read the language of symbolism, a great veil will fall from the eyes of men. They shall then know truth. And more than that, they shall realize that from the beginning, truth has been in the world unrecognized, save by a small but gradually increasing number appointed by the lords of the dawn as ministers to the needs of human creatures struggling to regain their consciousness of divinity." Now, Hans, what do you think about that statement?
That is a brilliant statement, especially when we are surrounded by symbols and esoteric hidden symbols in our daily lives, and we don't really notice them because they're so ingrained in the things that we do. And you ask yourself, what is a symbol? Well, it's an object or an image, an icon or a logo that represents a complex idea or a concept as well. And so what are some symbols that do this? Well, one that comes to mind is the Statue of Liberty. And so you get into the Statue of Liberty, and the symbolism there is freedom. However, I do find it interesting that the statue herself is still chained to the pedestal that she's standing on. But if you own a Rolex or a Tesla car, this is considered a status symbol. We work with symbols and icons all day long. The stop sign, the icons on our apps, on our smartphones, We work with emotional symbols, the emoticons that we use in our social media context. And so symbols surround us everywhere. They can be hidden simply within a logo, like the FedEx logo, where the negative space between the E and the X present the symbol of an arrow facing forward. Or they can be complex symbolism found within a simple logo or design, like the 7-Up logo. And for those who can actually see this symbol, like Manly P. Hall was saying, you realize that it represents the 7 chakras bubbling up from the root chakra, which is always depicted as a red circular shape. And so this is the red circle of the 7-Up logo. And then you get into the esoteric knowledge of the chakra points, and your crown chakra, which represents the pineal gland, is also symbolic of the lotus flower, which is what it's often depicted as. And as we know, the lotus grows out of the water and can also contain a lot of dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which is also constructed and built in your pineal gland in your own mind. And so the 7-Up logo, to those with eyes to see it, actually has such a deeper meaning than just a bubbly drink that we like from day to day.
Wow, you hit so many points that I want to touch on. For one, the Statue of Liberty and Lady Liberty, as we like to call it. And Jordan Maxwell was very famously talking about this many years back. And he, of course, is a legend talking about symbolism. And he was even, there's a soundbite of him that was used on one of the Wu-Tang songs. And Wu-Tang was a fan of Jordan Maxwell, of course, as many rappers were. And he's talking about how when you look at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, it says it was a gift to the first Masonic Republic from the French Grand Orient Temple Masons. And he would always point out that he said it's not actually a woman, that it's actually a man. And when you look back at Attis and all these things and how you see the
light bearer, it's the Lucifer, yeah.
Exactly. You have this idea of illumination, and you also have the coronas of the sun that are around on the crown, and then these coronas that are around the head. And why that's important, that also relates to the sun. The sun is the ruler of our world. It gives light and truth to everything. So that's why kings and queens would always wear a crown on their head, because it's the coronas. So the interesting thing also is when we see how this symbolism works, it's absolutely interesting to me that we find a lot of this ancient symbolism and esoteric symbolism in these corporate logos. And you mentioned 7-Up on how that there is the 7 chakras. Well, the same is for the rainbow flag. The rainbow flag, when you go into the other deeper meanings, and I'm not talking about the older versions, we can go to Tibet and places like that. But essentially, these are all, if you look at them, like all the colors of the chakras, or the Kundalini awakening that comes up from that. That's also important in that awakening. But I want to ask you, because when I look at this symbolism, and speaking of Jordan Maxwell, he used to tell me that he once met the young man that created the Starbucks logo. And again, there's Melusine on it, who's the siren is like Pisces. Obviously, when you look over at the Mazda logo, which if you look up even in their own literature, look on the Mazda website, they'll say, hey, this is after the Persian Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda. It's like the winged man in the flying disc, which is out of the Avestan literature. If we have any Zoroastrians, that's Fravashi or Fravahar. And you see these logos. And I want to ask you this as somebody who is in this industry, and you've done branding for a lot of big corporations. Is this done intentionally to use ancient symbolism as a means to communicate to our subconscious or our genetic memory? Is it meant to communicate to them on other sides? Are there secret societies communicating? Or is it just in general, there are things like colors and shapes that make these more palatable? What is the reason for this?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it kind of, it stems back in history. And so, as I was saying, the magic of symbols comes back to 3 simple shapes. And the shapes are the triangle, the square, and the circle. And when I went to design school, I was very fortunate to have teachers that taught me how to actually draw these shapes, but then how to make them photo ready and whatnot, because when I was going to design school, we didn't have the luxury of Photoshop or Illustrator, where at one click of a button, you have this amazing shape. We had to actually learn these shapes and how to make them. And how do you make these shapes? Well, the circle you make with a compass, right? And so you use the compass to create the circle. The square, you use a squared straight edge or ruler to create a square. And to create the triangle, you use both the squared straight edge and the compass. And it's fascinating that, going back into secret societies, the compass and the squared straight edge is the symbology for the Freemasons. And so this is a really interesting aspect, that we're learning these shapes using these old tools and techniques. And what's interesting about these three shapes is they can take on 4 different multipliers that totally change their meaning. And these three shapes, as you were saying, whether or not this comes into the corporate reality, these three shapes literally are the building blocks for every single symbol and logo and icon out there. And so if we add the multipliers, we have numerology that we can add. And so we assign numbers to these shapes. The triangle has 3 sides. The square has 4 sides. The circle has 1 side. And we add this up and it equals 8. Well, 8 is a magical number, right? In gematria, this is what we would do. We would add these numbers together to create 8. And we're surrounded by 8 every day and don't really realize it. We have 8 fingers on our hands. Thumbs are not considered fingers. If you want to win the game of pool or lose the game of pool, you sink the 8 ball. There's 8 notes in a magical octave, and it starts on 1 note and it ends on the same note, but it's at a higher frequency. We're surrounded by 8 3 times in the day. So the first 8 hours of the day is the morning, the second 8 hours of the day is the midday, and the third 3 hours of the day, or 8 hours of the day, is the evening. And combined, this makes 24 hours, and so on. And so these shapes, you know, definitely take on some interesting multipliers. A second multiplier is adding color theory to these shapes. And so in color theory, we either add light color. Everything that we're surrounded by is either the abundance of light or the absence of light. Everything that we see comes from light. And so if we assign red to the triangle, green to the square, and blue to the circle, we have RGB, red, green, blue. And when we combine these 3 light colors together, it creates a bright white light. If we were to use these 3 colors as pigments or printed colors, and we combine red, green, and blue as a printed or pigment color, we get a rich black, is what we call it in the design world. And it's interesting because this is representational of as above, so below. So you have the brightness of the sky, and then you have the richness of the soil beneath. You see this symbolism in the infinity and the unity of the yin and yang symbol. I like to look at this as an island in the middle of the ocean meets an oasis in the middle of the desert, and there's the Kundalini energy that connects the two between. If you look into movie symbolism, I love to quote Star Wars. If you look at the first 3 movies of the Star Wars saga, 4, 5, and 6, you have this interesting story of Luke Skywalker. And so Luke is symbolic of Lucius, or the sun, walking across the sky. And when it gets to night, he is fighting his dark father, Darth Vader, all the way until the next day when the sun vindicates or liberates the night sky. Okay, and so this is symbolic of the 3 movies. The first movie, you have Luke's story. The second movie, he's fighting his father. And in the third movie, he vindicates and validates his father by becoming the son that he has to become. And so the symbolism here is fascinating and amazing. And then you take it one step further and you add elements to these 3 shapes and 3 colors. And so the red triangle becomes the element of fire. The green square becomes the element of earth. The blue circle becomes the element of water. And these are alchemical symbols, because if you put together the prima materia, the earth, and the sacred water, and you boil it and burn it down with the fire, what you're left with is this white powder, this philosopher's stone, or as you've talked in other episodes, the mana, which is a white light stone, which is incredibly fascinating. But then we can take it one step even further, and we add dimensionality to these 3 shapes. And so the red fire triangle becomes the pyramid. Well, we know in ancient Greek, pyramidium means the fire in the middle, okay? And so then the square, which is the green earth square, becomes the cube. And the cube is representational of the earth. It has 6 sides, it's dimensional. It can be measured as through cubits or through the ruler, or if you're a despot or a monarch or something, you would also rule the land of the earth. And the 6 sides represent the 6 continents of the planet. So you have North America, you have South America, you have Eurasia, you have Africa, you have Australia, and you have Antarctica. So these are the 6 surfaces of the cube, which represents the earth. And then for the blue water symbol of the circle, you have the sphere, which becomes a globe. And how do you navigate the globe? With a compass. And so you're back to this ruler and this compass aspect. And you were quoting Zoroaster, or talking about Zoroaster earlier. And so in Zoroastrian, Zoroaster himself said that the greatest symbol of the human is to stack these 3 magical shapes together to create the symbol of the human. And so you have the circle, the triangle, and the square representing the symbology of the human. And this was like 1500 BC. And so if you take that symbology that he's talking about way back then, and you apply all of these multipliers that we just talked about, the head becomes the water element. The upper torso becomes the pyramid or the fire element, and the lower torso becomes the cube or the earth element. And so when you look at the head, what do you look at? You see water, right? And so we ingest water through our mouths. We have our salivary glands. We have our mucus. We have our tear ducts. A lot of our sweat starts in our forebrow or our head. And we have the sacred water of the pineal gland, right? So then you move into the upper torso, and this becomes the pyramid or the upside down pyramid, and the fire is in the middle. Well, what is our fire in our middle? It's our heart. It's pumping our red fire blood, right? But then we also have all of our processing organs within the upper torso as well. And they are burning the fuel that we feed our bodies to make our bodies work. And then in the woman, you have the sacred womb space, which is a generator for the next generation of life. And so then you move into the lower torso, and this is representation of earth. And in our lower torsos, we are grounded to the earth. Through our excrement, we refertilize the earth. And for men, our sacred seed comes from this lower element of earth. It's the earth seed, and it fertilizes the egg in the womb, which creates the spark or the fire of life in the generation or generator of the womb, creating the next life. And so all of these symbols together create this magical aspect of symbolism, and it can then be applied to corporate logos or esoteric knowledge as well, moving it into different directions. And so coming full circle back around to corporate logos, this is a fascinating question, a fascinating topic. Some of the older corporate logos, I believe, utilize these symbols with hidden meaning, with esoteric meaning for those who are looking to see them. In my own field, I've created logos that definitely utilize these aspects. But if we're looking at corporate logos that represent, like for instance, the circle, we can look at the ESA or European Space Agency logo, which is a dark blue circle representing the water of Earth. The E represents Europe or the Earth. And then there's a dot in the circle. And if you look at the dot, this could be a satellite, it could be the moon, it could be the star of Sirius. There are different representations of what it could mean. Or you look at a logo like the AT&T logo, and you also have a blue sphere. And through the blue sphere are stripes, white stripes. And these represent telecommunication or fiber optics. But if you're looking at as a water or sphere element, then these stripes actually represent the clouds that cover the water. And so there's an interesting esoteric, background to that symbol as well. If we're looking at triangle logos, look no further than Delta Airlines, right? Delta is the 4th letter of the Greek alphabet. Its symbol itself is a triangle. And the Delta logo is 3 pyramids rising from the ground. So it's showing flight. So you have a smaller pyramid, you have the negative space in between, which is the secondary pyramid. And then you, on top of that, you have the third pyramid, and they're both dimensional shapes. And then you get into the square logos. Well, we could look at the squares of the mind's eye with, or the stained glass windows of, and the windows to the eye of the Microsoft logo. But another logo that I really like to look at that has such magic involved in it is the Rubik's Cube and the Rubik's logo. And so here we are, a cube. It has 6 sides. There are 6 different colors, and each side has 9 squares or 9 facets of color. And to solve the puzzle of the box, you have to unify each side with a different color of these 9 squares. And what's fascinating with the number 9 is it's one of these master magical numbers. And so hidden right there in plain sight is a number that if you add it to itself or you multiply it by other numbers, the gematria of this number will always equal 9. For instance, 9 plus 9 is 18. 18 is 8 and 1, that's 9. Add another 9 and you have 27. 2 and 7 is 9. If you multiply 9 by 6 for the 6 sides of the Rubik's Cube, you have 54. Well, 54, 5 plus 4 is 9. And 9 is a magical symbol of man as well, because we spend 9 months in the womb, right?
And that's the secret, by the way, to Revelation 7 and 14 in the Bible, because when it says 144,000 people can be saved, that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses tell everybody.
Wow.
That's the secret, is that the gematria equals 9. And as you mentioned, that's why we spend 9 months in the womb. But I want to back it up a bit. And you mentioned Rubik's Cubes, which of course come from here in Hungary. That's where it comes from.
Wow.
The Hungarians are they're very proud of that. There's literally a museum here of Hungarian inventions, and they mention so many things. I mean, you'd be amazed at how much the Hungarians have invented, from the Rubik's Cube to the discovery of vitamin C, the ballpoint pen, the helicopters, stuff in agriculture. The list goes on and on. But when you were talking earlier, we can definitely look at that compass in the square for masonry. One of the definitions of the G in the middle of that compass and square is, if you talk to Masons, they'll have 3 basic meanings of the G.
God.
God, gnosis, and geometry. And the reason for that is that Plato said God geometrizes continually, that the whole world is made of geometry. You ask someone out there who has taken psychedelics, you talk to them about whether it's mushrooms or dimethyltryptamine, DMT, right. They've noticed that there's these worlds of geometry, or as Terence McKenna says, jeweled shaped basketballs and all this sort of
and
stuff.
Machine elves, yeah.
all that stuff, exactly. That there's this geometry that we don't notice that's in the underlying makeup of our world that's on another level. But what's also interesting, you mentioned the number 8 and the significance of 8. And 8, the reason why it's the infinity number, and this is another teaching from the esoteric thinking, is that when you put your pen down on a piece of paper, the reason why 8 is the infinity symbol is that you can continually draw it in these loops without lifting your pen off the paper. And there is a lot of significance in that when you look at the idea of even the founding of America. If you look at even going back to July 4th, 1776. Well, July, at the beginning of July, we have the rise of Sirius, which is important. Right. But also, if you take the numerology from that, like 1 plus 7 from 1776, look at that, 1 plus 7, you're going to get 8, and 7 plus 6, you're going to get a 13. You're going to get a connection there to very significant numbers. And there's a hidden constellation. A lot of people don't know this. A hidden Masonic constellation, America. But we'll talk about that another time in the connections to Amaruka. But with this also, you were talking about the pyramid, or the triangle and the circle. And as you mentioned with pyramid, pyramid, the fire in the middle. And yes. you mentioned the circle with the womb. Well, again, this is old school Jordan Maxwell. But when you would be out with Jordan Maxwell and he and I'd be walking around, he would always point out to me, he'd say, you see the American restrooms. on the traditional American, and this is changing now because now we're having
Definitely is changing now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we these days we have different conversations about gender and all that sort of stuff. But if you look at the old idea of the restrooms, is that you would have a triangle for the men's restroom for
Yep.
that procreative fire, that, and again, that goes back a long ways, and the circle, but like the circle of life, and that was on the women's traditionally on the
restroom.
women's restroom.
Yes.
And this sort of symbolism being used, it does go back a long ways. But as you mentioned, we are looking at other patterns. There's significance to these numbers and patterns we see in the world. And one thing I've talked to you about before is when you look on the Skull and Bones Club, and when you look at that, underneath their door, they have a skull and bones, which is just, whenever you see that symbolism, it's like in masonry, Hiram Abiff, the widow's son. It is a symbol of immortality, actually, and resurrection. So it's like the Jolly Roger that you saw from the that we later saw with the Pirates of the Caribbean.
From the Pirates,
from the Templar.
A lot of them, yeah, that comes straight out of masonry as well, which is really interesting.
It does. Now, here's the thing: it says 322. Now, 322 is from Genesis 3:22 in the Bible, and it's literally talking about this everlasting life, attaining immortality, all that sort of stuff. But you see that this 322 now becomes significant. And the reason I'm mentioning this is it reaffirms what you said. Because, okay, let's look where 322 is also mentioned. The Georgia Guidestones, which are very controversial. And I don't believe that the Georgia Guidestones were talking about a limited population in the world. I think they were talking about a population of a certain type of people, which I believe were hybrids, which they believe would be on the planet. They weren't going to, they're a little different than what people think. They had like,
this relates to the king's lists in Sumeria and Egypt as well. So anyway, go on.
Yeah. Right. Oh yeah, right. And it had like all these various languages. It was a calendar. It was a clock. It was all kinds of things. And even when its destruction was not an accident. That's all part of where it was. If you look at the Georgia Guidestones, look when it was raised. It was raised on 3/22/80. Okay, 3/22/80. 322 is very important. And when you dig into who raised it and the name that was used, it's also very interesting. Now, also look at the 322. Just coincidentally, when I was traveling through Europe, I was traveling back from Egypt when all the quarantines and lockdowns and everything started. Look at the date when that was all across Europe. It was 3/22 when that started. So what you got to see is that there's not one secret society or group out there that it has the monopoly on these keys, but essentially secret societies and organizations, they communicate. So those that have eyes to see with the symbolism you're talking about, Hans, that they use ciphers, like whether it's alphanumeric, they use certain symbolism in ciphers. So the old way things used to be is that if you had a business and you put something in your logo, that folks in that group knew they could come, do business with you or get a good deal, or that would be more friendly. And people have been doing that a long time, even since times of religious persecution, or the story in the Bible about the Passover. They put the blood on the door so they knew who to pass over. There's all ways of communicating these signs and seals. Now,
the black spot in piratism, right? If you receive the black spot, then everybody knows you're cursed. So there's
exactly. And what I wanted to ask you, have you ever been approached by a major client, a major company, whether you can say or not, that has asked you to intentionally embed a type of esoteric symbolism into their logo?
I definitely have. I kind of can't disclose the client, but the symbolism is there. And as I was leading up to my description of these three symbols earlier, whenever I'm approached to do identity or branding design, I'm always asked to create an emblem or a word mark that represents the culture, the business practice, and the messaging of a specific business. And so in my own career here in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm located, I worked with an analytics company and redeveloped their logo, their Cascade Insights, and the A of their name becomes analytics because they're an analytics company. And I represented it with the cascading or building of a pyramid, because this is an analytic device. The pyramid has so many different codes encoded within it, as do analytics. However, it also represents, the structure of the Cascade Mountains. Another logo I've developed here is the In the Mix Records logo. And for me, this symbolizes the infinity and the unity of the yin and yang, with the black and white hands coming together as a fist bump. But it also represents being in the mix of the music industry culture. A third symbol I've developed that I was specifically asked to encode, some symbolism into, is a company called Phoenix Media. They do printing and production here. The modified P of the Phoenix Media logo represents the bird in flight, right? The phoenix rising from the ashes. But if you look closer, it also represents the nail and the cross. And so you have a direct relation and a direct symbolism here to the crucifixion and the resurrection. And so definitely I've been asked by specific companies to encode stuff into my own work, but a lot of it comes naturally because we're trying to, as designers, simplify messaging and get across more information within the design that people understand. And since we're all now so trained and so attuned to symbols, if we start looking for them, we're going to see these symbols everywhere. But you were mentioning, older companies throwing in symbology in their own corporate structure. For sure, a lot of these companies have Masonic ties, and you will always see star symbolism within their logos. The star of Sirius, the dog star of Sirius FM, the dog with the star eye, or even OnStar, which is an interesting company, because here we have two words within the word mark on star, which also represent the logo of On with the star. And as you have described in other shows, On was the name for the city of Heliopolis, which represented the sun, or the bright sun. And so in Masonic tradition, the bright sun is always considered Sirius, and it's a sun that they revere within their structure and their symbolism as well. And so seeing logos that have a bright star or a bright sun singularity within the logo, if you know what to look for, this is a company that if you're a Mason, you can do safe business with. Or, a lot of the older logos pick this up. Some of the newer logos, not so much. But a lot of the older logos and old long-term corporate brands definitely have some of this stuff baked into them, because these three symbols, the square, the circle, and the triangle, are also the building blocks of a lot of those shapes. The triangle builds the star, right? The cube unfolded builds the cross. I mean, there's a lot of these things that go on.
It's definitely true that the blazing star of Freemasonry is Sirius. And as a Mason, Masons are taught to leave behind signs and tokens in their work.
Yes.
So it's funny because, this conversation has come up before. I was giving a talk, a lecture in Los Angeles with my friend Hank Kracher, and we were at the Scottish Rite Temple. We were giving a talk, and it came up. We were talking about how the Gmail logo looks very much like a Masonic apron. You have the G from Google, which is just like in Masonry. You have the App Store, looks like, again, a compass and a square. The Facebook logo looks like two balls and a cane. Or as you and I have discussed before, it's just like the 007 from John Dee.
This was the symbol of John Dee, and where Ian Fleming came up with the idea for James Bond as well. Yeah,
exactly. Now it's interesting because there's no doubt you can see the similarities. They're there, but it's not some pernicious thing. It's not somebody that's doing something bad. It could just be Masons having fun. Let's say there's somebody there that wanted to leave that behind in their work, and there's people out there that will say, oh, I don't agree with that. But then again, when you look over at the Oscars, or we see certain things that might look like Ptah or Osiris, there is a powerful connection to the ancient world that we all have, that when we see certain things, they stand out to us. And we know that there's esoteric meaning in colors, just like there's esoteric meaning in sound. A lot of these things have certain power. They have certain meaning. We've done psychological studies where people walk in a room And, there might be the color red that might, stimulate passion or excitement, or blue or whatever is going to relax you. I think even in the syntax of our language, you can say, well, she was green with envy. He was
Oh, right.
seeing
Yeah.
red. I'm feeling blue. We talk about this. Do you look at color as a very important
color is hugely important. And if you look into like Japanime, for instance, and manga, you'll notice that a lot of the characters have different color hair, and we're starting to see this come out in society today. But in manga, each color of hair has a different personality aspect to that character, and it's very specific. And the Japanese have encoded this in literally all of their manga and Japanime, which is yeah.
It's incredible. I just had Professor Corey Anton on the show, and he talks about semiotics, media ecology, and he looks at symbolism on a level for universities. He's given TED Talks on it. And we were just talking about the idea that we had these old symbolic languages, like you take the hieroglyphics, and we were just talking about that, how, that's changed over time, but this ancient symbolism we had and how we communicate with this, it's very powerful. It's very evocative. It's
one symbol tells 1,000 stories,
exactly.
An image is 1,000 words, a photo is 1,000,000 words. And so it's interesting that you say these ancient Egyptian symbols, because when you're looking at the triangle, square, and the circle, if you combine them, like Zoroaster was talking about, to create the symbol of the hue man, where when you break the word hue and man apart, hue is a color or a pigment. So the hue man is the colored man. We're all the colored man. And that was the representation of the circle, the triangle, and the cube, or the square. But you go back even further into, say, Egyptian culture or ancient Comitian culture, and you have this magical symbol of the Ankh. And as we know, the Ankh is known as the key of life. And there's no coincidence that this also represents the sacred womb. And so in the key of life, you have the teardrop or the circle. It's sitting over two triangular shapes, which represent the arms or the wings, which then are standing on a rectangular base, which represents, the grounding of the base. But if you look at it as the womb, it's the vaginal canal, and it's the fallopian tubes that house, the ovaries, right?
It is.
There's no coincidence there either that the symbol for woman is a circle on top of a cross. So, I mean, wow. We've gone from ancient Egyptian or ancient Comitian symbolism all the way to modern day. And then another combination shape like that, to all the Harry Potter fans in the audience, is the Deathly Hallows. And so this is a triangle with a circle and a rectangle in the middle of it. The triangle represents the invisibility cloak. The circle represents the resurrection stone. And the rectangle in the middle represents the elder's wand.
Sorry. Exactly. It's found through there, and it's so brilliantly been put into that story. And it's interesting, before we leave the subject of the Ankh. So the Ankh, again, that's why Christians need to realize the cross is a very ancient symbol.
Right.
Paracelsus talked about how it was the sun being divided up into its cycles, but the cross, when we look at it in that way, the Ankh, and there's the proto-Hindu symbol of a cross too. It goes back so far. There's so many crosses. But when you look at it in that way, not only does it have the sexual procreative energies coming up into it, but also if you look on the horizon, it's also the sun rising and that light coming up there. It's transformed.
Horus on the rising horizon.
Right. Horus has risen. Horus, horizon. And how many Horuses or hours you have in the day. But here's an interesting thing about that. When the Rosicrucians came along with the rosy cross, if you look, here's a secret about this for everyone. And they talk about the invisible college, which is really an astral meetup place, like the Egyptians called the underworld.
Duat, right, yeah.
Right. When you look at that symbol, and this is why symbols transform, and sometimes they have layers upon layers for the initiates to see. When you look at, let's say, Rosicrucianism, but Christian of the Rosy Cross, Christian Rosenkreuz, he came along and they Christianized
RC Christian.
Right, exactly. When you look over at, you go to California, even at the Amorc headquarters, and you look out, why do they have Tutmos III, who they consider their immortal deputy grand master. He's still
Akhenaten, yeah.
Yeah, well, Topmost the Third from the 18th dynasty, who also was the head of the Great White Lodge, because he was eating these white cakes, the Great White Brotherhood, which is they wrote about a lot in Alexandria. He had this at a Karnak. They were eating the manna, the cakes.
The mufkas or whatever they were. Yeah.
Right. Well, there's a story behind that. We'll have to get into that as well in another show. But when you look at that, the Rosicrucians consider Topmost the Third to be the head of their group. Now, when you look at the Ankh, what did they do? They repackaged the Ankh into the Rosy Cross. So the Rosy Cross that you see for the Rosicrucians is the exact same principle. The rose in the middle is like the Shekinah. Shekinah is, when you talk about the Holy Spirit, that is the feminine form of God in those traditions. Because I truly believe all of those religions and traditions were born out of not only when we look in the Vedas and Hinduism, but also Egypt. So really,
there's so much overlap. Yeah,
it's the exact same thing you talked about with the masculine coming into the feminine, to the emanation of the light. It's also, there's alchemy in there. There's a transformation, and it's all been embedded into so many layers into that beautiful symbolism. But this symbolism is very ancient. And that's the other thing I always tell people, Hans, is that when we go back into what the Theosophists were saying, what Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was saying, she said there's 7 keys to the mysteries. And when you know these keys, you read the Bible, you read scriptures.
All the layers, right.
You have to turn the lock 7 times, whether it's biological, geographical, whether it's religious, it's all
scientific, it's all there, yes.
So when did you first wake up to the keys to these mysteries and started to see the symbolism? Were you always aware of this before you started this work, or did you find out about it after you started this work?
It's a bit of both. I mean, as you know from the last show I did with you with the Dropa stones, I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal. And living in Nepal, you're surrounded by symbolism all day long, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Buddhist. You have Muslim symbolism there as well. And so there's several symbols that always would I would see and would kind of influence my days. Some of these are like the mandalas, which are a layering of squares, circles, and triangles, a layering of colors. They also represent the fire, the earth, and the water. That's all found in the mandala symbol. You see Nags or snake symbolism all over the temples. You see the symbol for fortune and good luck and prosperity, which unfortunately, we now know today as the swastika, which was usurped and changed by the Germans before World War II to represent.
But before you continue, do you know where you find the most of those in the world? You find them when you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem. Google this. This is true. They're the most that you'll ever find of that symbol are on the mosaics on the floor that are still there, which is really, really interesting. But it's an ancient sun symbol, and we can go back to the Vinca and all that. But please continue. Sorry.
That's fascinating you say that about the mosaics on the floor. If you've ever been to the Jolivel Hotel in Egypt, and you go out by the infinity pool in the back, all of the tiling is swastikas.
It's an ancient symbol, very ancient symbol. The Nazis,
super interesting. Yeah.
The Nazis stole it.
Oh, of course, and they usurped it, and they changed its meaning. And anyway, getting back to symbolism in Nepal, another huge symbol that you see there are the eyes of Buddha. And the eyes of Buddha are always represented as these 2 tranquil eyes. The third eye is, represented by a spiral or a bindi or a tika, and it sits over the nak, which is your nose, which is also a Nag, right? And so it's representation of the spiral or coiled serpent, which the coiled serpent or the spiral represents DNA or life or the Kundalini energy, but oftentimes this spiral serpent in the Buddha's eyes is also represented as a conch shell. And if you break the conch shell apart, it also is built through a spiral. And this is where our word for consciousness comes from. But if you step back from the symbol and you just look at the shapes of the eyes in the coiled snake and the bindi or the third eye, you have the representation of a winged serpent. And so this gets into the symbolism of the Caduceus or even in Zoroaster, this winged craft or winged serpent in a sense. And so I was always surrounded by these symbols then. And when I went to university, and unfortunately I had a really horrific accident. I got hit by a car on my bicycle. I totaled the woman's car with my bicycle on my body. And I had a lot of downtime. And in that downtime, I started downloading a lot of information, whether I was channeling it or whether I was downloading it, and watching it online. I'm not entirely sure at this point, but I started really getting into a lot of symbolism, and I watched a lot of stuff that Jordan Maxwell was talking about, and a lot of stuff that Tessarian was also talking about, and even Freeman Fly and Jamie Hanshaw were talking about. But they were approaching this from an outside perspective of symbols. And here I am in the graphic design world going, wow, I'm utilizing and using these all day. And I'm starting to notice and realize that these are all around me. They're everywhere. And at some point it's not an obsession, it's just an understanding, like the Manly Hall quote from earlier. Once society wakes up and starts seeing these symbols, it will have a profound change on society, because we start recognizing the simplicity of symbols around us. God, even our remote control on our TV has the triangle, the square, and the circle. And what do they represent, on the remote control? Well, the triangle is play. That starts the fire. Then you have fast forward, slow forward, fast backward, slow backward. Well, this is the direction that the fire can be taken in. It can be taken fast forward or slow forward, or fast backward or slow backward. We have the stop symbol on the remote control, which is a square. Well, this grounds or halts the production of the movie, right? And then we have the pause symbol, which is a broken square. And then we have the record symbol, which is a circle. And like water, or the circular element, water retains knowledge and it retains information. And so when you're hitting record, what are you doing? Well, you're retaining the knowledge of the information for future tense. And so, you look at the movies, and then I was talking about Harry Potter earlier, before we got back into some of the older esoteric stuff. And you look at the druids and the magicians, and what were they making their wands out of? They were making out of the wood of holly, or the holly tree. And when they would cast a spell, like the Patronus spell in Harry Potter, it would create a bright silver light that would bedazzle people. Well, symbolically today, we look to Hollywood, the wood of the holly, to dazzle or bedazzle us with the light across the silver screen. And so there's all these symbols, all around us every day. And as I always love to quote movies, there's a great scene in the movie Pi where the main character, Max, he's discovered this 216-digit number. He's starting to see it everywhere. People are starting to pay attention to it. There's a religious faction trying to link this number to the El, or the Elohim, or the Tetragrammaton, but they're also trying to crack the stock market with this number. And his mentor, which is interesting, his mentor's name is Saul. So here you have a sun representation, or a sun symbol, or a soul symbol, like as his mentor. He tells Max, he says, Max, if you're going to become obsessed with this symbol or this number, you're going to start to see it everywhere. 216 steps to the bank, 216, leaves on a tree, so on and so forth. You're going to start to see this everywhere. And so in today's, lecture that we're talking about here, I want people to recognize that we are using this triangle, square, and circle symbology throughout the history of time and recorded history over and over and over and over again. And it still has the same value. You were talking the Rosicrucians. Well, what is the rose? So the rose is a round petaled flower. So there's your water element. It has a stem. This is your representation of the square, or the rectangle is the stem. And then it has the triangles of the thorn, and that represents the fire. And so you have within the rosy cross of the rose itself, this amazing, alchemical symbol is right there. And then you look at where the rose is used. Well, we had the War of the Roses, right? In early Europe, where all the families of the early monarchies were all related, and they all had a different rose as their symbology.
Yes, even the Tudors had a rose. The rose was very significant. And there's so much you're saying that's very interesting. Also, that when you're talking about the movie Pi and the connection to numbers, even numbers, just fascinating, because you see the Arabic numerals that we see that came about. If you look, I think it was somewhere in the 10th century. If you look at the angles, or how you break down your numbers, and how that was given to us by these mathematicians, when you look at the Arab and Indian origins of it, and then it was adopted into Europe. People don't realize that what the Arabs had attained. I mean, so many different, so much knowledge they had attained at various times from Egypt and other places like that. Like even alchemy that was brought out of Egypt, they called it alchemia, and that was brought into Europe. And how a lot of that stuff came to Europe also was it came into Spain. So a lot of Spanish is also affected by the Arab folks that were there, as well as the adaptations of like surgery and medical breakthroughs and all that sort of stuff. And of course, there was other conflicts through history with the Ottoman Empire and everything we know. So it wasn't a complete smooth assimilation and transition of things, but it's interesting how these symbols played a role. Hans, I want to ask you if you could to finish up with another story about a movie you told me, and I do want to continue this conversation because
we can get into word emblems and spells and number spells. There's so much we can talk about around this. It's unbelievable, but I wanted people to realize that a lot of what we're looking at in logos and icons that we're surrounded by every day come from these three magical symbols.
Yes, and you know, you definitely pointed that out, and I think this was a good way of a primer to get people started, because this is a very big conversation, one that we're going to need to continue to go even deeper.
It's huge.
we need to go even deeper and to look at it, and that's why I'd like you to go deeper in it. And as you said before the show, you know, as you pointed out, why these are very magical and how words work. That's why we call it spelling, when you're spelling something that you were saying. And I wanted you to touch down on a really cool story that you'd shared with me about the movie The Last Mimsy and how it relates to the Intel logo. If you could share that.
Definitely. So the movie The Last Mimsy is a really fascinating one. It was written for children, but it has so many adult themes and topics going on in it. It's amazing. And so a quick breakdown of the movie. In the future, we have lost something in humanity. We have lost our ability to love. And so our future selves have discovered time travel technology, and they figured that they would send back a series of toys that the innocence of children, the symbology there, could figure out at some point in time, figure out and master these toys, and then send them along with their own DNA encoded with love back to the future. And so The Last Mimsy is the last attempt that they have to do this. And so they send back a box that ends up on Bainbridge Island on the beach, and these two children that are always there on vacation discover it. There's a young girl and her older brother. And within the box are a bunch of broken rocks, which they called spinners, because if you spin them, they have this levitation ability. There's a cell phone looking device that represents fractal geometry. And there's a stuffed rabbit. And it's interesting that this stuffed rabbit also shows up in Alice in the Looking Glass as one of the attempts previously to send these toys back. And this is the white rabbit from Alice in the Looking Glass. And the white rabbit has, wow, so much symbology across different culture. It's the white jade rabbit of the Chinese for the rabbit in the moon. There's a lot of symbology around this. And on its chest is a spiral symbol. So this is the symbol for DNA, but it's also the symbol of down the rabbit hole or through the looking glass. And both kids start to discover that the toys are talking to them. And there's a connection that happens between these children and the toys. And the parents realize this. And so they try and take the toys away from the kids, which creates this element of love, right? Mimsy's talking to the little girl. The boy's realizing that he's having these dreams about mandalas and Tibetan symbols and Einstein-Rosen bridges and so on and so forth. And something happens. He opens a portal, and it shuts down the city of Seattle's electricity. And so obviously, the feds and the three letter agencies get involved, and they start looking at the microscopic elements of these toys. And within the rabbit Mimsy, they discover a microscopic emblem or logo associated with her chip structure that is the Intel logo. And back then, the Intel logo had a circle around it, and it represented Intel. There was this God creation along with this logo, but today's logo for Intel is just the spark, and it's the spark of life, or it's the spark of artificial life. And so it's interesting that the spark of humanity of the future comes from this technological logo from the future back to the past. And as you know, a lot of these movies don't get greenlit unless companies like this actually read the script and say, hey, we're going to greenlight this because this is spot on. And so as they're talking about this, they're like, wow, we've hypothetically discussed, quantum entanglement and time travel, but we've never really put it to practice. And so it's fascinating that ourselves in the future send back these toys that are made by Intel to our present day to have these children fall in love, drip the tear of life or the DNA from the child's innocent tear, which is also an alchemical symbol, right, onto the rabbit and the spiral of the rabbit, which then is sent back to the future through an Einstein-Rosen bridge technology.
Wow.
And when you look at how we're depicted in the future, they depict us as gray aliens. And this is fascinating because if you get into the story of the Greys, to get down a whole different other rabbit hole, one of the stories of the Greys is they are us from the future trying to replenish something that they have lost in their own humanity so that they can then reproduce and not have to continually clone or stylize themselves. And it's interesting, in this movie, it's represented as love. This is the missing element that we have lost in our future, is love. And it's the most powerful message in the movie. And at the end of the movie, once these toys come back, the gray aliens unzip their suits, and it's literally us, the Adam and Eve of us. It's a young boy and a young girl unzipping their suits to recreate the future or regenerate the next generation of the future from the DNA of the love sent back to the future. And so we're just wearing these suits primarily because we can't breathe our own atmosphere, and we've destroyed our planet because we've fallen out of sequence with love. And so the symbology of this movie is so huge, and it's a movie that is completely missed. I have a cat that I rescued, and I named her Mimsy, and I named her Mimsy because I rescued her, so in a sense she could rescue me. There's this love bond. And so again, this is the power of symbology. It can invoke an emotion. We were talking about this once before, where you get into a cathedral, and the cathedral has its own womb and Vesica Piscis symbolism. But when you stand in the center of the cathedral, what is there? There is a spiral or a labyrinth on the floor. Well, this is the symbol of Mimsy, right? And when you stand in the middle of that church, you are inundated with light. You are inundated with sound. It's similar to going to, the Hathor temple in Egypt, where if you are there at the right time of day, this beam of light penetrates the room, and you stand in it, and you become the light.
That's it. Because, well, when Leonardo da Vinci and you had Michelangelo, Raphael, all those folks in the Renaissance period, or any of those people designing these great places like St. Peter's Basilica, all the sacred geometry that was used and the way they designed it, the way these places are placed, they're placed on ley lines and places of great energy, which they had a way of building them along. They were made so when you reach the altar, you'd be in an altered state. And there's all kinds of secrets in the architectonics, and we could do a whole show on that, like what folks
for sure.
cathedrals and all the stuff that's encoded into these. But yeah, what you said was absolutely very beautiful, Hans. And I think that the deeper meanings and layers of this, because they tell us everything in the movies. It's all put out in the movies, and that's another interesting discussion to have. Also, is
yes,
why is that so? Are these other forces that play upon the subconscious of people, sort of like we have simultaneous inventions in our world that we know this happens? They happen in more places than once. There's a huge
The 100th monkey syndrome.
right. There's a huge history, if you guys look this up, of various inventions around this planet that happened in more than one place at a time, at the exact same time, exact same point in history, which is fascinating. Hans, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me back on. This has been really intellectual and amazing, and I appreciate this conversation.
Well, I appreciate it too, and we appreciate you, and we definitely want to have you back. We want to continue this discussion. We're going to get more in depth with symbols as we go on in this series. And I'm going to tell everybody, please do check out Hans's websites, his work. I'm going to put links below in the comments. And it's much easier than them trying to write it down. They'll just click it and go right to your site. And for all of you who are listening, we appreciate you. Please do like this video, drop a comment below and let us know what you think of this discussion. Is there a certain symbol that stood out to you that you've always looked at, or maybe you've always wondered about? And also please share this with your friends. Get the word out there. We're going to do more of these shows. If you have any guest suggestions, bring them here. Or if you want Hans and I to discuss some of these subjects on the next segment, let us know if there's a logo you've always wondered about. And until next time, we'll meet you at that place behind closed eyelids.